Bradley Whitman thought he was only humiliating a quiet woman in a gray cardigan, but before the night was over, every executive in that glass tower would remember the exact moment his arrogance began to collapse. The 40th floor of Nexera Systems glowed above downtown Chicago like a polished jewel, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the city lights, the Black River below, and the slow movement of expensive suits crossing the marble lobby. It was the company's annual Innovation Gala, the kind of evening where investors spoke softly over sparkling water, engineers stood nervously near demonstration screens, and every smile seemed measured against stock options and future contracts. Emily Carter did not look like she belonged there, at least not to people who only knew how to measure worth by clothing, titles, and the confidence of a handshake. She wore a plain gray cardigan over a simple white blouse, dark slacks, and flats that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than impression. Her light brown hair was tied low at the back of her neck, and in one hand she carried a canvas tote that looked painfully out of place beside leather briefcases and designer handbags. Beside her stood Claire Bennett, her younger cousin, a junior project coordinator who had invited Emily as her guest because she hated the thought of Emily spending another evening alone after months of caring for her sick mother. Claire kept glancing around, trying not to look nervous, but Emily moved with a quiet steadiness that made no demands on the room. She paused near the refreshment table, accepted a paper cup of coffee, and listened more than she spoke. That was when Bradley Whitman noticed her. At 43, Bradley had built his reputation on pressure, polish, and public victories. His navy suit fit perfectly, his silver watch caught the light whenever he lifted his hand, and his smile had the thin sharpness of a man who believed kindness was something useful only when witnesses mattered. As chief operations officer, he liked rooms where people stood straighter when he entered. He liked silence after he spoke. And most of all, he liked knowing exactly who ranked beneath him. His eyes moved over Emily once, from the cardigan to the canvas tote to the modest shoes, and a look of amusement settled on his face. He leaned toward two senior managers beside him and murmured just loud enough for them to hear, "Who let the freeloader onto the executive floor?" One of them gave a small laugh before realizing Claire had heard it. The sound traveled farther than Bradley intended, not loud enough to stop the event, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. Claire's face flushed. Emily's fingers tightened only slightly around her coffee cup. She did not speak. She did not defend herself. She simply looked at Bradley with calm eyes, as if she had seen men like him before and had learned that answering too quickly only gave them more room to perform. Bradley took her silence as weakness, the first mistake of the night. Across the room, a massive screen displayed the logo of Nexera Sentinel, the billion-dollar artificial intelligence platform that was supposed to impress every investor before dessert. Lines of live data moved across the screen in neat blue streams, but Emily's gaze shifted toward one corner where a tiny pattern repeated twice, then 3 times. Her expression changed so briefly almost no one noticed. Almost no one, except a young engineer named Owen Miller, who saw her lips move as she whispered, "That loop will collapse under live traffic." Before Owen could ask what she meant, Bradley stepped closer, smiling now because he had found a target small enough, he thought, to make himself look powerful. The room had not gone silent yet, but it was getting ready to. Bradley stopped beside Claire as if he were not approaching 2 guests, but inspecting a problem that should have been removed before it reached the public floor. His smile stayed in place, polished and cold, while the light from the demonstration screen moved across his face in pale blue stripes. "Claire," he said, drawing out her name with the kind of disappointment that made nearby conversations slow down, "I thought human resources was very clear. Executive events are for employees, approved guests, and strategic partners. They are not family picnics." Claire swallowed hard. "Mr. Whitman, Emily is my cousin. She is my registered guest. I checked with reception before bringing her up." Bradley glanced at Emily again, not with curiosity, but with the lazy certainty of a man who had already written the ending in his mind. "Your registered guest is standing beside a $2 billion product launch holding a grocery tote and muttering at our system dashboard." A few people nearby looked over. Claire's cheeks turned red, but Emily remained still, her eyes lowered for one quiet second before returning to the screen. She was not bothering anyone, Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. She has had a difficult year. I did not want her sitting alone tonight. That was all Bradley needed. Sympathy, in his mind, was a weakness people used when they had no achievements to offer. He tilted his head and gave a soft laugh. A difficult year. Of course. There is always a reason. Always a story. Always someone else expected to carry the weight. The words landed heavily. Emily heard them, but she did not flinch. She only moved her thumb along the seam of her coffee cup, slowly, once, twice, as if counting something no one else could hear. Claire stepped closer to her. That is not fair. Bradley's smile sharpened. Fairness is not the issue. Judgment is. This company is about contribution. People in this room built something, funded something, risked something. We are not here to provide atmosphere for someone who needed a warm room and free hors d'oeuvres. The small circle around them widened as people pretended not to stare. A senior analyst looked down at his drink. One of the managers who had laughed earlier suddenly found the city skyline fascinating. Emily finally looked at Bradley directly, and for the briefest moment, his expression faltered. There was no shame in her face. No apology. Only a quiet patience that did not belong to someone defeated. Mr. Whitman, Claire said softly, please stop. But Bradley had already mistaken attention for authority. He turned his body slightly, making sure the people nearby could hear him. This is exactly why junior staff need boundaries. They work hard for 6 months, get invited upstairs once, and suddenly they think the executive floor is a shelter for personal liabilities. Claire looked as if she had been struck by the words, though no hand had touched her. Emily set her coffee down on the table with careful precision. Across the room, Owen Miller continued watching her, still bothered by what she had whispered about the system loop. On the screen, the blue data streams flickered once. Then again. The change was tiny, almost invisible beneath the gala lights, but Emily saw it clearly. Her eyes moved from the dashboard to the server status panel, then to the live traffic estimate climbing toward the demo threshold. She spoke under her breath, so softly only Owen caught it. You have about 4 minutes. Owen took one step toward her. 4 minutes until what? Bradley heard him and turned, irritated. Miller, do not encourage this. Emily did not answer Bradley. She kept her gaze on the screen, where the repeating pattern had begun to tighten into something dangerous for the company, though no one in the room understood it yet. The first warning light blinked yellow. Then another. Bradley's face remained smug, but behind him, the system he trusted more than any person in the room had already begun to fail. The yellow warning lights seemed harmless at first, like small imperfections in an otherwise flawless performance. Most guests did not notice them. They were too busy watching Michael Reynolds take the stage with the relaxed confidence of a chief executive who believed the night had already been won. He was 61, silver-haired, calm, and known across the industry as a man who could make investors trust a product before the first slide appeared. Behind him, the Nexera Sentinel logo expanded across the screen in clean white letters, and a soft wave of applause moved through the room. Bradley straightened his jacket, satisfied that attention had shifted away from the awkward scene near the refreshment table. He leaned toward Claire and said quietly, "Take your cousin downstairs before she becomes a larger embarrassment." Claire opened her mouth to answer, but Emily touched her wrist with 2 fingers, not firmly, only enough to ask for patience. Her eyes were no longer on Bradley. They were on the live traffic counter climbing toward the demonstration threshold. 500,000 requests per second. 700,000. 900,000. The number rose like water behind glass. Owen Miller, standing a few feet away, looked from Emily to the screen, then back again. Something in her stillness unsettled him. Most people panicked when systems failed. Emily looked as if she was listening to a familiar song go slightly out of tune. On stage, Michael smiled and began. Tonight, you are seeing the future of predictive infrastructure. Nexera Sentinel does not just respond to risk. It anticipates it. The screen shifted to a live simulation, showing thousands of digital transactions moving through a map of the United States. Blue lines connected Chicago, Dallas, Denver, Atlanta, and San Francisco. Then one line flashed red. Michael paused for half a second, barely noticeable. The red line multiplied. A thin murmur passed through the technical team near the sidewall. Bradley's head turned sharply. The system status panel blinked again, and this time the warning was not yellow. It was red. Owen whispered, "No," Emily spoke almost under her breath. "There it is." The simulation froze. The elegant blue network collapsed into a blank gray field. For one terrible second, the entire 40th floor heard nothing but the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant traffic far below. Michael Reynolds kept his expression controlled, but his hand tightened around the presentation remote. "A minor delay," he said smoothly. "Our team will refresh the live environment." Bradley was already moving toward the engineers, his smile gone. "What happened?" he demanded. One technician stammered that the routing engine had stopped responding. Another said the recovery protocol was looping. A third admitted the backup model was returning the same failure. Investors began exchanging looks. A woman from a major venture fund lowered her glass and whispered to her partner. Across the room, a corporate client who had flown in from Seattle checked his phone with visible concern. Bradley felt the ground shifting under him, and, because men like him rarely blame systems they had praised 5 minutes earlier, he searched for a person to blame instead. His eyes found Claire first, then Emily. "Unbelievable," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "The most important demonstration of the year, and we have distractions standing beside the technical area." Claire stared at him. "We did not touch anything." Bradley ignored her. "Miller, why was she commenting on the dashboard?" Owen hesitated, caught between fear and honesty. "She noticed the loop before it failed." That sentence changed the air. Bradley turned slowly toward Emily. For the first time, his irritation carried a flicker of uncertainty, but pride quickly covered it. "She noticed nothing," he said. "People who do not understand complex systems often mistake random details for insight." Emily looked at the frozen screen, then at the engineers struggling behind it. Her voice stayed quiet. "It is not random. Your recovery model is calling the same corrupted dependency every time it tries to restart. That is why the failure keeps repeating." The engineers stopped typing for a heartbeat. Bradley gave a short laugh, too loud and too sharp. "That is a very confident sentence from someone who came here for free coffee." The room tightened around those words. Michael Reynolds, still on stage, looked toward Emily for the first time. And in that suspended silence, the woman Bradley had tried to dismiss stood calmly beneath the cold white lights, seeing the whole disaster more clearly than the people paid to prevent it. Michael Reynolds stepped away from the presentation screen, and the silence followed him like a shadow. He did not rush. Men in his position learned long ago that panic traveled faster than truth, especially in rooms filled with investors. Still, his eyes stayed fixed on Emily Carter, the quiet woman in the gray cardigan who had just described the failure with a precision that his own operations team had not yet managed. Bradley saw that look and felt something bitter rise in his throat. It was not fear exactly. It was the insult of being interrupted by someone he believed should have remained invisible. "Michael," Bradley said quickly, forcing a professional calm into his voice, "we are handling it. The technical team has protocols for this kind of event." One of the engineers looked down at his laptop because the protocols were failing in front of everyone. The recovery engine restarted, flickered, and collapsed again into the same red warning. A low murmur moved through the guests. The woman from the venture fund folded her arms. The client from Seattle stopped pretending to check messages and watched the screen with narrowed eyes. Bradley turned toward Emily, his jaw tight. "Since our guest seems so eager to diagnose enterprise architecture from across a refreshment table, perhaps she would like to explain how she became such an expert." Claire stepped forward. "Please leave her alone." Bradley ignored her because cruelty often becomes louder when embarrassment has an audience. "No, Claire. This is useful. We should all learn something tonight." Your cousin has apparently solved in 30 seconds what our senior engineers have been reviewing for months. A few uncomfortable laughs came from people who did not want to be involved, but still wanted to belong to the powerful side of the room. Emily remained still. Her face was calm, but the light in her eyes had changed. Owen Miller noticed it first. It was the look of someone measuring not just a system, but a room full of people. Bradley walked to a nearby workstation and lifted the laptop from its docking station. "Here," he said, carrying it back with exaggerated courtesy. "Go ahead. Entertain us." He placed it on the high table beside Emily, turning the screen toward her. "Show us how someone with no badge, no title, and no invitation beyond family sympathy saves a $2 billion platform." The words struck Claire harder than Emily. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the emotion away. "Emily, you do not have to do this," she whispered. Emily set her tote gently on the floor. The small sound seemed louder than it should have. Then she removed the elastic band from her wrist and tied back the few loose strands of hair near her face. It was a simple motion, almost ordinary, yet something about it shifted the room. She looked at the frozen dashboard, then at the engineers, then finally at Michael Reynolds. "Do you want the system to look stable?" she asked, her voice quiet enough to make people lean in. "Or do you want it to actually be stable?" Bradley laughed once, but no one joined him this time. Michael studied her for a long second. "Can you identify the failure?" Emily answered without hesitation. "I already have." The room went completely quiet. Bradley's face tightened, because he had meant the laptop as a joke, a little public theater to put her back in the place he had assigned her. But Emily did not look humiliated. She looked ready. She pulled the laptop closer, placed her fingers on the keyboard, and the first thing everyone noticed was how naturally her hands found the keys. Not like a guess pretending. Not like a beginner guessing. Like someone returning to a language she had once known better than her own name. Emily did not ask for a chair. Owen brought one anyway, sliding it behind her with the caution of someone approaching a live wire. She sat, angled the laptop slightly, and opened the diagnostic console. The white letters on the black screen reflected faintly in her eyes. Around her, the room held its breath in layers, the nervous silence of engineers who feared being blamed, the skeptical silence of executives who did not want to believe her, and the uneasy silence of guests realizing they might be watching something far more important than a failed presentation. Bradley folded his arms, trying to look amused. "Any time now," he said. Emily did not look up. Her fingers moved once across the keyboard, and a stream of system logs appeared. She scrolled faster than most people could read, stopping only when a line of code repeated at the same interval as the warning pattern. Owen leaned closer, then froze. "That should not be calling the archived model," he whispered. Emily nodded slightly. "It should not, but it is. The live routing layer is falling back to an old dependency every time the traffic passes 1 million requests per second. The backup is not protecting the system. It is reintroducing the failure." One of the senior engineers stepped beside Owen, his face losing color under the cold office lights. "That dependency was removed last quarter." Emily highlighted a file path without hesitation. "Not removed. Renamed." Then referenced through a compatibility wrapper that no one updated. The engineer stared. Bradley shifted his weight. "This is technical theater," he said, but his voice had lost some of its force. Emily opened a second window and began tracing the recovery sequence. Her movements were calm, exact, almost spare. She did not waste a keystroke. She did not mutter for effect. She simply followed the failure backward through the system, as if walking through a house she had built with her own hands. Michael Reynolds had moved closer now, no longer pretending this was a minor delay. His expression was careful, but his eyes were sharp. "Can it be restored for the demonstration?" he asked. Emily paused for the first time. "Restored, yes. Trusted, not yet." The answer landed harder than reassurance would have. Bradley stepped forward. "We need the demo back online, not a philosophy lecture." Emily turned her head just enough to look at him. A system that only appears stable is not stability. It is a future apology waiting for the wrong customer. No one laughed. Claire watched from beside the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, seeing a version of her cousin she had only glimpsed in late-night notebooks and quiet conversations that ended whenever anyone got too close to the past. Emily returned to the keyboard. She disabled the faulty wrapper, isolated the corrupted dependency, and rerouted the recovery engine through a clean model instance. The red warnings flickered. Then the first one disappeared. Then the second. Across the room, the frozen gray screen blinked once. Blue lines returned to the map, thin at first, then stronger, reconnecting Chicago to Dallas, Denver, Atlanta, and San Francisco. A murmur rose, but Emily was not finished. "Do not celebrate yet," she said softly. She opened another panel, one the engineers had not accessed during the panic. "There is also a security exposure in the prediction cache. It has not been exploited tonight, but it could have been." The senior engineer looked at Owen. Owen looked at Michael. Michael looked at Bradley. The silence changed shape. It was no longer doubt. It was recognition arriving slowly, like sunrise through glass. Emily typed 17 clean lines, reviewed them once, and pressed enter. The dashboard shifted from red to amber, then from amber to green. System integrity, 99.7%. Traffic capacity, restored. Response speed, improved by 38%. The 40th floor went completely still. Bradley stared at the screen as if it had betrayed him. Emily removed her hands from the keyboard and sat back, quiet again, almost invisible except that no one in the room could look away from her. For several seconds, no one moved. The dashboard glowed green above them, clean and steady, as if the failure had never happened, but the people in the room knew exactly what they had witnessed. The engineers looked at the restored system with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Investors leaned toward one another, whispering with the careful excitement of people who had just seen a disaster become a miracle. Claire stood beside the high table, her eyes fixed on Emily, not because the code had worked, but because the room had finally seen what Claire had never known how to explain. Emily Carter had always seemed quiet, but not empty. Distant, but not lost. Tired, but never ordinary. Michael Reynolds stepped closer to the laptop. "May I?" he asked. Emily moved her hands away from the keyboard. Michael bent slightly, studying the lines she had written, then the older sections of the architecture she had uncovered. His expression changed slowly. The calm executive mask softened into something almost personal, almost haunted. "This structure," he said quietly, "I have seen this before." Bradley's head turned. "Michael, with respect, we should not overstate what happened here. She found a configuration mistake. The team could have done the same with a few more minutes." Owen looked up sharply, but did not speak. The senior engineer did. "No, we could not have done that in a few more minutes." His voice was low, but it carried. She traced the dependency chain, repaired the recovery model, and found a cache exposure none of us had flagged. That was not luck. Bradley's face tightened. "Everyone is impressed because the timing was dramatic." Michael ignored him. He scrolled upward through the old architecture file Emily had opened, then stopped at a comment buried deep inside the system documentation. It was only 2 words and a date from almost 11 years earlier: Carter Framework. Michael inhaled slowly. The city lights blinked behind him through the glass, but he seemed to be staring into another time entirely. "We tried to acquire this design in 2014, he said, before Nexera had the capital to build Sentinel. The original creator refused to sell the core model and disappeared from the industry less than a year later." A strange stillness settled over the floor. Bradley gave an impatient laugh. "That is impossible." Emily looked at him, not offended, only tired of the word. Michael turned to her. Carter," he said softly. "That was you." Claire's lips parted. Owen stared as if the room had shifted beneath his shoes. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Emily Carter," she said. "The early papers used Eleanor Carter because Eleanor was my mother's name. She was ill, and I wanted privacy. Later, when she needed full-time care, I walked away." Michael's face carried the weight of recognition. "You built the foundation of the system we are standing here presenting." Emily glanced at the green dashboard. I built an earlier version. Your team built this company around it. Bradley stepped forward, desperate now to regain control of a room that had quietly left him behind. If that were true, there would be records, contracts, proof. Emily reached into her canvas tote and removed a worn leather notebook, its corners softened by years of use. She opened it to a page covered in neat equations, routing diagrams, and the same recovery logic now glowing on the laptop screen. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Michael looked at the notebook, then at the screen, then at Bradley. The truth had become too visible to insult. Bradley's mouth opened, but no words came out. The man who had called her a burden stood surrounded by the very people who now understood that her mind had been carrying part of their future long before he ever entered the room. Michael Reynolds closed the leather notebook with the care one gives to something that should never have been treated casually. For a moment, the room seemed divided between the life Emily had lived in silence and the life everyone had just discovered beneath it. The investors were no longer whispering about a failed demonstration. They were whispering her name. Owen Miller stood beside the laptop, staring at the restored dashboard like a student who had just watched a master solve a problem the textbook had never dared to print. Claire wiped at the corner of one eye quickly, hoping no one noticed, but Emily noticed. She always noticed the quiet things. Bradley Whitman looked from the notebook to Michael, then to the faces around him, searching for one expression that still belonged to him. He found none. "This is all very moving," Bradley said, his voice thin but still dressed in arrogance. "But we have investors here, Michael. We cannot let sentiment rewrite corporate history in the middle of a live event." Michael turned slowly. The softness in his face disappeared. "Corporate history is exactly what we are discussing." Bradley forced a smile. "Then let legal review it privately. Tonight is not the place to elevate an unverified guest because she had one lucky moment at a keyboard." The senior engineer, a woman named Dana Price, stepped forward. "That was not one lucky moment." Bradley cut his eyes toward her. "Dana, I would advise you to be careful." Emily stood before Dana could answer. She did not rise dramatically. She simply stood, and somehow that was enough to quiet the room again. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "you have spent this evening deciding who belongs in a room by how they look, what title appears under their name, and how useful they seem to you." Bradley's jaw tightened. "I was protecting the company." "No," Emily said gently. "You were protecting your place in it." The sentence landed with a force no raised voice could have carried. Michael looked at Bradley for a long moment, then turned to his assistant near the stage. "Pull the incident reports from the last 6 months. All complaints tied to executive floor conduct, employee intimidation, and technical escalation delays. I want human resources and legal involved before the end of the night." Bradley's face changed. "Michael, that is unnecessary." "What is unnecessary," Michael said, "is humiliating an employee and her guest in front of clients to cover a system failure your department failed to address." The client from Seattle stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "For the record, our concern is not that the platform failed. Complex systems fail. Our concern is how leadership responds when they do." Bradley looked at him, then at the investors, realizing too late that the room had become a mirror. Every insult he had thrown at Emily now reflected back on him. Claire finally found her voice. "Emily did not come here to embarrass anyone." Emily glanced at her cousin with a faint, sad smile. "No. I came because you asked me to get out of the apartment for one night." A quiet ripple moved through the crowd, not laughter this time, but recognition. Bradley swallowed. "Miss Carter," he said, the title awkward in his mouth, "perhaps I spoke too quickly." Emily looked at him steadily. "You spoke exactly as you saw me." No one moved. Even the lights seemed colder. Michael stepped beside Emily and faced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you did not just see Nexera Sentinel recover. You saw the mind that made recovery possible long before most of us understood what we had been given." Applause began softly, almost uncertain, then grew across the marble floor. Emily did not smile for the applause. She looked down at the canvas tote Bradley had mocked, then lifted it quietly from the floor. Bradley stood frozen as the sound rose around him, not because Emily had taken revenge, but because she had not needed to. The applause did not make Emily taller, louder, or more eager to claim the room. It only made the truth harder for anyone to ignore. She stood beneath the clean white lights with her canvas tote against her side, looking almost the same as when she had arrived, except now every eye followed her as if the quiet woman in the gray cardigan had become the center of gravity. Michael Reynolds waited until the applause faded, then addressed the guests with a steady voice. The formal demonstration will resume in 10 minutes. Our technical team will validate the restored environment, and every client here will receive a full written report by morning. No hiding, no polishing, just the truth. That sentence did more to calm the investors than Bradley's entire evening of controlled smiles. People respected certainty, but they trusted accountability. Dana Price and Owen Miller moved quickly to the workstation, not to overwrite Emily's work, but to document it. Owen glanced back at her with open respect. "Miss Carter," he said, "would you mind staying close in case we miss something?" Bradley flinched at the title. Emily gave Owen a small nod. "I will stay until the system is safe." The words were simple, but they carried the kind of authority that did not need a badge. Near the stage, Michael's assistant returned with a tablet, her face serious. She handed it to Michael without speaking. He scanned the first page, then the second. The reports were not new. They had been waiting in company files, softened by polite language and buried under department approvals. Junior employees described being dismissed during urgent escalations. Contractors described warnings ignored because they came from people without senior titles. One complaint mentioned Claire by name, noting that Bradley had publicly questioned her judgment after she raised a scheduling risk that later cost the company 2 weeks of work. Claire stared at the tablet when Michael showed it to her, her face pale with the strange pain of realizing she had not imagined the pattern. "I thought maybe I was being too sensitive," she whispered. Emily turned toward her. "You were being observant." The room heard it, and several people looked away, ashamed not because Emily accused them, but because she did not have to. Bradley stepped closer to Michael, lowering his voice, but not enough. "We should discuss this privately. I have given 7 years to this company." Michael looked at him with a sadness that felt colder than anger. "Then you had 7 years to learn how to treat people." Bradley's mouth tightened. "I made one per comment under pressure." Emily looked up from the laptop. "No, Mr. Whitman. A poor comment is a mistake. A pattern is a mirror." The sentence stopped him. It stopped everyone. Michael handed the tablet back to his assistant. Effective immediately, Bradley Whitman is removed from all operational authority pending a formal review. Dana Price will lead technical recovery. Owen Miller will support the audit. Claire Bennett will join the product integrity team for the remainder of this launch cycle. Claire blinked. "Me?" Michael nodded. "You saw problems before people above you wanted to hear them. That is exactly the kind of person this company needs closer to the product." For the first time all evening, Claire smiled. Bradley looked as if the floor beneath him had become glass. The people he had treated as background were now being asked to step forward, and the woman he had mocked was the reason. Michael turned to Emily. "And you, Miss Carter. Nexera owes you more than gratitude. I would like to discuss a consulting agreement, full credit for the original framework, and whatever terms you believe are fair." Emily closed her notebook slowly. "My first term is simple. No one in this building gets called a liability for needing help." Michael nodded once. "Agreed." Emily looked toward Bradley, not with triumph, but with a calm that made triumph unnecessary. "And my second term is that the people closest to the work get heard before the people closest to power." Outside the windows, Chicago glittered in the night, indifferent and beautiful. Inside, the room went silent again, but this time the silence did not belong to humiliation. It belonged to change. The final demonstration resumed with none of the glittering arrogance that had opened the evening. There were no exaggerated claims, no polished promises delivered over hidden cracks. Dana Price explained the restored environment in plain language. Owen Miller confirmed the recovery path and documented the cash exposure. Claire stood near the product team with a tablet in her hands, still surprised by the weight of being trusted, but no longer shrinking from it. Emily remained beside the workstation, quiet as ever, watching the system breathe under real traffic. The blue lines on the screen did not dance for applause now. They held steady. Chicago to Dallas. Denver to Atlanta. San Francisco to Seattle. 1 million requests per second. Then 1.3 million. Then 1.6. The dashboard stayed green. When the room finally applauded again, it was not for a performance saved from embarrassment. It was for the truth that had been allowed to stand in public. Bradley Whitman had moved to the edge of the room, no longer surrounded by managers waiting for his approval. His badge still hung from his jacket, but authority had already left him. He watched Claire answer a question from an investor, watched Owen speak with confidence he had never permitted in meetings, watched Dana take command of the recovery team without raising her voice once. Then he looked at Emily, the woman he had tried to reduce to a word, and understood that the word had only revealed him. When the guests began to leave, Michael Reynolds approached Emily near the windows. Far below, headlights flowed along Michigan Avenue like rivers of gold. "You could have let us fail," he said. Emily slipped the worn notebook back into her canvas tote. "I thought about leaving." Michael nodded, accepting the honesty. "Why did you stay?" Emily looked across the room at Claire, who was laughing softly with Owen over something on the tablet. Because the system was not the only thing caught in a bad loop. Michael absorbed that in silence. Behind them, Bradley approached slowly, his face pale, his voice stripped of its earlier shine. "Miss Carter," he said, each word careful now, "I owe you an apology." Emily turned to him. She did not look angry. That made it harder. "I should not have called you what I called you," he continued. "I was under pressure, but that does not excuse it." Emily studied him for a moment. "No, it does not." Bradley swallowed. "I misjudged your qualifications." Her eyes remained steady. "You did not. Just misjudge my qualifications, Mr. Whitman. You misjudged my humanity. That is the part you need to repair, and not with me first." Bradley looked toward Claire, then toward the engineers who had suddenly become people in his eyes instead of functions beneath his command. For once, he had no polished answer. Emily picked up her tote and walked with Claire toward the elevator. The marble floor echoed softly beneath their steps. No spotlight followed them. No grand speech stopped the room. But people moved aside with a respect they had not offered when she arrived. As the elevator doors opened, Claire whispered, "I had no idea." Emily smiled faintly. "Most people do not. That is why kindness matters before proof." The doors closed on the 40th floor, leaving behind a company changed not by a louder voice, but by a quieter one that had finally been heard. And that night, everyone at Nexera learned that dignity does not need a title, genius does not need permission, and the person you dismiss at the door may be the one holding the whole room together.